Before we begin, this video may contain some subjects talked about in great detail that might make people uncomfortable and could be a little bit odd to cover in such great detail. However, in order to parse through the allegations regarding jobless reincarnation and its main character, we do have to go to some places. So, if you are the type of person who finds things uncomfortable and will automatically assume that I'm supporting them by analyzing them in detail and being objective about something, then please, this video isn't for you. Jobless Reincarnation, the series that filters people like nothing else. I mean, aside from being one of the greatest isekai stories out there, what with one of the most well-structured worlds and a very true-to-form fantasy story, there is one significant thing that this story is known for. We're talking about its main character, Eris Greyrat. Again, because in spite of constant online discourse, there are plenty of people who still cling to the idea that he's the worst character ever and that he's responsible for some downright awful stuff. There's plenty about Rudy that isn't perfect. He's definitely been a pest with his own set of crimes by our standards. However, some people take things a little too far. In order to cover this topic as thoroughly as it needs, there are some things we'll have to get answers for first. Number one, we'll have to answer the question of Rudy's actual age, which requires two inquiries in and of itself. So we'll have to talk about Rudy's connection to his past life, as well as what we as a society generally use as a metric for what we consider an adult. After that, with the preliminary information sorted out, we can parse through Rudy's actual actions in the story and compare them to the allegations lobbed against him. Then, once we've laid out all of the information and the cases against him and determined what he's actually guilty of, we can talk about the purpose of those incidences within the context of the story and how people have reacted to it. So without further ado, let us begin. So question number one, how old is Rudy? The first major issue many people take up with this series is the idea of Rudy's classification as a person, whether he's an adult or a child. So in reality, it's better phrased not as how old he is, but as is he an adult or a child? We'll need to answer that before moving on to anything else. Many will simply resort to the 40-year-old man in a child's body argument and leave it at that, but I honestly think that this definition is terribly short-sighted. It does point to the fact that at the very least he should know better than to behave the way he does, an entire core concept of the show where Rudy's character revolves around the idea of him being less mature than he actually thinks he is. But more than that, this 40-year-old man in a 6-year-old body sounds awfully familiar, don't it? Where have we heard that argument before? Right, my least favorite subject of all time. Lolicon. The issue I have with this particular argument is it comes from the same people who would be upset if you showed them a lolly and claimed it was a 400-year-old dragon that just so happens to look like an 8-year-old girl. And look, I'm not wanting to get into the whole lolicon thing nor make a major stance here or now, because the vastly conflicting definitions that I've found online that range from purely platonic inclinations towards a cute young animated character, to people like myself who prefer petite women like Frieren and Tatsumaki, all the way to an actual sexual attraction to artwork of prepubescent children taking massive pipe, have made it really hard to figure out what actually this shit is. And look, I don't trust any sources on this matter either, since there's literally no reason for anyone involved to not obfuscate the truth, especially if it is the worst case scenario, and this requires me to do some digging into the history of it and reading some of the literature from which the term is derived, and that's all work that I don't feel like doing for this video and isn't terribly relevant. So we'll just leave it at that, because, well, none of that ramble was really the point. There's only one reason I bring up the lolicon stuff right now. I've seen many of the same kinds of people who make the argument against Mushoku Tensei based on the fact that Rudy is quote-unquote mentally older, i.e. the types of people who will cry and piss and moan over the quote-unquote sexualization of children if you show someone under the age of 18 in a slightly revealing outfit. Meme on the fact that lolicons will use the argument of 1,000-year-old witch and so on and so forth. And to turn around and use the same justification for a character to be an adult is honestly utterly hypocritical and destroys your credibility. And honestly, I don't even think mental maturity alone is a good thing to judge by. Back to the issue, though. The first step I decided to take in this was to look into the link between Eris Greyrat and the unnamed shut-in that he used to be. To do so, I decided to read up on some of the Buddhist ideas of reincarnation because I wanted to understand the mindset of how this religion views it. Buddhism being one of the two primary religions in Japan that could have been a somewhat influence on how the author views reincarnation. According to what I was able to find, the belief is a bit more complicated than just a soul being transferred to a new life. Buddhism makes a point in generally believing that it isn't a direct reincarnation, although Buddha himself was able to access the memories of his previous lives in spite of this. It seems more commonplace that it's not simply a recycling of the soul. Generally, that idea of reincarnation, the one that comes from the English/Western modes of thinking, is kind of a different concept altogether. Effectively, some tenets of Buddhism assert that nothing is actually transferred across lives, but there is a sort of causal link between them. Basically, the essence of a being, but not the soul nor consciousness, is transferred. And based on your karma from your last life, that essence is given a new fate and form. Really, the term for it in this situation is more properly rebirth. And this is in line with the later statement from Rudeus himself, as he comes to realize that the old shut-in he has memories of was not actually Eris Greyrat in any particular way, and that he was merely pretending at adulthood by standing atop a mountain of memories and regret. This puts an interesting distance between the man Eris Greyrat and the life he still holds memories of. But the title of the series is legitimately Jobless Reincarnation, the idea of a soul reborn, so why bring this up? Well, I think it sort of helps to frame some of these things into the context of the writer's point of view, especially as some concepts exist in Eastern thinking that don't actually in Western thinking. And if I could actually read Japanese, I'd have loved to delve much more deeply into this subject because translation can play a part in how these ideas are communicated. Needless to say, dominant religion in an area can highly influence morality. That's why you have difference in standards between the Western world, which is dominated by Christian principles, Middle Eastern morality dominated by Islamic principles, and the various different kinds of religion in Asia, be it Hinduism, Shintoism, or Buddhism, depending on which region you talk about. So a bit of a look into the culture becomes somewhat necessary to a degree, what with culture informing morality, but we don't need to get into the whole subjectivity part of that in this video. It's not relevant. And I find it important to try and take into account those cultural differences since the way the author sees it is important. So that brings us to Rifujin Maganote's thoughts on this and how he frames the whole situation. And we kind of find some evidence along this same line throughout the story. Of course, he retains memories from his old life, yet he's still to some extent a very different person. The real kickers are in specific lines delivered about the nature of his life. Like in episode 9 of season 1 when Rudy first meets the man god and he's told that his astral form is based on how he sees himself, not on how he actually is. Him being the old shut-in has nothing to do with who he actually is and more so how he sees himself, and it would be impossible not to given the memories that he has of his old life. This is a very interesting distinction. His soul doesn't actually take that form other than based on how he sees himself. Meaning that if he were to see himself as Paul Greyrat's son, as he does in season 2 episode 24 when he says that he's just a brat playing pretend at being an adult, it would ultimately change his astral form and soul. This lends to the belief that Rudy and the previous life are only really connected by memory and nothing more. But this alone is not exactly a final nail in the coffin of all the accusatory arguments. Like I said, it's preliminary. Something to keep in mind as we go forward with this discussion. Again, we're talking about phrasings that are very interesting and lines of dialogue that don't seem to be made a huge point of, but are highly relevant to this particular discussion. It seems to paint the picture that the memories in Rudeus himself are somewhat separated, but that's about as far as we can go with this line of thinking, really. Effectively, Rudy is a person influenced by the memories of his past life, but not so closely linked to that past life that he is exactly the same person in a different body. But that last bit is kind of a moot point in a few cases because while he may be a different person altogether and much more separated from his previous life than many would think, he still very clearly retains those memories and should know better as an adult, per se, than to do the things he does. So that brings us to our second issue of clarifying Rudy as either a child or an adult. The standard of maturity in the real world, and more often than not, we do not consider the mental age of someone the only criteria by which they are considered an adult. The issue stems from the fact that I think there are some issues with only using one criteria, because if you rely too much on one standard, it falls short. The issue with mental maturity being that it becomes hard to define, what with there being illegal exceptions to someone's age as to whether they're considered an adult in any country. Some places have laws that allow you to get married before the age of majority, and that by proxy makes you a legal adult. And even if you wanted to use one standard, like the US's age of consent at 18, you're going to find it actually varies from state to state. A general standard for the world becomes even harder when it comes to age of adulthood because across time, the idea of mental maturity has varied. Thanks to modern scientific developments, we know someone isn't fully mentally mature until their mid-20s, when their frontal lobe is finally done developing. Romans didn't even consider someone a fully legal adult until the age of 30 at one point, and it was later revised down to 25. But even then, they considered the end of childhood at the age of 15 and had ceremonies by which boys were deemed adults. So here's a bit more of a history lesson for you. Age of consent, or age of adulthood, or just the general concept of who's considered an adult, since they're generally concepts that are closely correlated, fluctuates very drastically from society to society and even across time. Hell, the legal distinction didn't even really come up until the medieval lawmakers decided to really hammer home the difference between what could be considered an adult and a child. So this idea of being an adult has largely fluctuated around several concepts, one of which being the capacity to make decisions for yourself via the accumulation of worldly experience. That's part of the reason why a lot of countries don't allow people to sign contracts, own firearms, drink until certain ages after their point of adulthood, all of that kind of stuff. But when it comes to sex, marriage, and general independence, it seems it was actually far more common throughout time to consider the physical maturity of anyone involved than anything else. But even in this day and age, there are wildly varying ideas of who can do what and at what age. In the Philippines, age of consent is as low as 12 years old, something I personally think is incredibly ridiculous. In Germany, it's 14, with some extra legal elements to protect the youngins in the case of a major age gap that could lend to the exploitation of some young people. In Japan, it's 16, as with what some people in my live stream chats who happen to hail from Europe have said about their own home countries. And in most of the United States, it's 18, while in Texas, it's 17. But back to the medieval lawmakers, they decided to use puberty as the hard line between adult and child. But even that becomes a bit erratic because puberty can set in as early as 8 years old in some cases. But I think it's generally on the right track because being physically mature is important. Ultimately, the lawmakers in question decided upon the age of adulthood being 12 for girls and 14 for boys because it was about this time children were developed enough to be considered adults, even considering the different ages at which people begin to mature physically. And this is ultimately why I argue it's better to use the actual points behind the decisions that our countries have made rather than the actual real-world numbers we have selected, because by defining what we consider an adult, we've come up with a point by which you can actually assess something in this fictional scenario. So in case you're not following, the definition I'm arguing for of an adult is someone who has the ability to reproduce, as well as the ability to make decisions for themselves in an informed manner. Basically, I think that both mental maturity and physical, or rather sexual maturity, are very important for considering someone an adult. That's why I would never consider someone like Kana Kamui from Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid an adult, because she is capable of neither of those things, in spite of the fact that she is well above any age of consent laws, considering she's 400 years old. But why does sexual maturity matter? Well, it means that you physically hit the point of your life where you can be considered fully grown by the fact that you are capable of sexual reproduction. We consider non-human living things adult or mature once they reach sexual maturity, so in cases where neither the intelligence nor morality of a creature is regarded, we resort to its physical maturity, its ability to reproduce. For humans, by the age of 18, you are considered qualified by both standards. Your body is capable of sex, and in general, your mind is developed enough to be able to handle the biological and emotional ramifications of any such actions. This is why PDF stuff is inherently one of the most horrendous crimes you can commit, because it's a sexual desire for or act involving someone incapable of both physically bearing and mentally handling the idea of sex, giving birth, and child rearing. That's why PDF stuff is bad. It's not so simple a fact as interests in children are depraved because society arbitrarily says so. It's the fact that it causes legitimate harm to the child in ways that we can prove and consistently find in these cases. They fundamentally lack the physical ability and mental ability for such things. Children's bodies are not capable of having other children. Their minds are not capable of comprehending it or bearing the weight of its consequences, regardless of how knowledgeable or mature they may seem. And no, children are not capable of making such weighty decisions in an informed manner and therefore incapable of consent. Children, human beings yet to go through puberty, should not be involved in these sorts of things. I think I've made that pretty clear. Those reasons are why we consider it the most reprehensible act a human being could possibly commit, and why these types generally get beaten or shanked in prison. So 18 years old isn't just a purely arbitrary number put in place by the government to stop you from enjoying the forbidden fruit. It's rooted in these fundamental reasons of protecting young people until they've both physically matured and accumulated enough life experience to be capable of managing on their own, making informed decisions about things that will totally alter their life. So why go through all of this information? Well, because people stuck in their ways about jobless reincarnation will insist it's bad in the face of just about any argument because it makes them uncomfortable, and they like to do their moral grandstanding. I get it, we all want to protect the children, myself included. But we need actual reasons and proof to say Rudy is a PDF file or a groomer, and that requires a few things. One being definitions that will help us determine whether he is an adult or not, and thus make a standard we can use reliably. So I'm making a definitive proof we should all be able to theoretically agree on, one that generally incorporates our real-world sensibilities into a format that can be used fairly on fictional settings. Not that it helps, because then these people will just turn around and say that Jobless Reincarnation is the only series that needs a legal proceeding to prove that it isn't PDF stuff, but I digress. Is this all starting to come together now? Has my long-winded spiel finally connected? If you want to make the argument that Rudy is an adult, you ultimately make an argument that physical maturity has nothing to do with it, and that mental maturity is the only metric, and there are issues with that. I've already laid out how Rudy is more attached to this life than the last, through reincarnation, so regardless of whether you want to cling to the feeble idea that he's somehow much older, you're only producing massive issues with your own argument with a double standard. I wanted to examine the reasons we have behind our own laws and the morality that upholds them, and I formed these points from what I derived from them. All that said, how does this apply to our defendant, Rudeus Greyrat? Well, I think we all know the answer. He aces the mental capacity check, what with his past life memories, but flunks the physical part of it, which effectively means he can't actually be considered an adult until about 15, when his world actually considers him an adult. There is something to be said about the biochemical elements of this whole argument, but most of what Rudy is accused of takes place before puberty sets in, so we can somewhat dismiss this element as a moot point. The fact is, Rudy's still a minor when a lot of these things that people will accuse him of happen. His world's age of adulthood is 15, which comes from the fact that this world is themed after a medieval European setting. As for the main points that we've established, here's what we've got so far. Rudy's connection to his previous life really only exists in the memory of it. Rudy, in spite of whether he is or isn't the same person, should know better because of those memories. Rudy is a child in this series up until he turns 15 in this world. So that's one of the major sticking points of this series resolved. Like I said, a lot of the arguments against Rudy and his morals is effectively predicated on the idea that he is an adult in this setting. Because in order to accuse him of being a groomer or a PDF file, both of those things require that he's actually considered an adult. It's not PDF stuff if it isn't an adult acting on a sexual desire for a prepubescent child. Yeah, that's a very specific definition because it's a very specific heinous crime, okay? Now, sleeping with any old minor is still statutory rape. It's still very, very illegal to go on your Dr. Disrespect arc here in the United States, regardless of whether they are 8 or 15. But just like you couldn't accuse two 16-year-olds of any of these crimes for sleeping together, you can't do the same to Rudy if he actually isn't an adult. Now, there's still a line of thinking that can be applied even there, that none of it matters because Rudy thinks he's an adult, but does believing that I'm a dinosaur and also the second coming of Jesus Christ actually make me either of those things? At some point, objective reality rules over personal belief. Whether Rudy thinks he's an adult or not, he isn't. He's an immature boy with the memories of another life. There's a flaw to trying to frame Rudy as an adult that I've already covered, no matter how you want to slice it. Most arguments predicated against Rudy are based on the idea that he's an adult. But now that we've gone through that, it brings us to the next section of the video, going over the accusations and the actual crimes he's accused of. And we're gonna do this based on each character he's supposedly or very blatantly wronged. Because yes, there actually are some things he's guilty of. So plaintiff number 1 would be Roxy Migurdia. She's notable for being the first real example of Rudy's degenerate inclinations with an inclination toward women. His great offenses include peeping, theft of underwear, and grooming. So what do we know about Roxy at this time? Let's start there. Well, as a demon, a member of the Migurdia people, she lives longer than any human. She's roughly between the age of 20 and 30 by the time she first shows up at the Greyrat household, making her an adult. And she clearly has some sort of drive, as she herself would peep in on Paul and Zenith doing the do and would totally get off to it, by the way. Now, thanks to what seems to be a racial trait, as many of the Migurdia seem to look far younger than they are, her general body type is rather petite and lacking the usual seductive prowess of more buxom women. And this is where Rudy's most nefarious actions come into play. He notes that she's right at that perfect age where she's exactly his type. That's how he puts it. The exact wording is in the throes of puberty, so adolescence. Basically, Rudy is into these petite, small women who look young. And if you want to turn this into a height of consent argument over his preferred body type, well, I would suggest you don't. Roxy is both sexually mature and mentally able to support herself at this point, regardless of what Rudy thinks about her. Rudy's comments are not helpful to his case, but the accusations don't ultimately stack up to the behavior displayed. Sure, it's a trashy thing to say, but if we're trying people over things that they've said rather than things that they've actually done, our whole system of justice is then fucked. You actually have to prove he acted in some way to fulfill that strange desire other than the general perverted antics that he displays. Rudy would ultimately attempt to butter her up with otome game tactics, but if that constitutes grooming, then any guy who's ever sweet-talked a girl in his life is guilty. His only real offenses towards her are pretty much juvenile perversions like stealing her underwear and peeping on her. Both things that should be frowned upon, but nothing in there that actually comes with the negative inclination that he groomed Roxy, tried to sleep with her, or anything else. If your strongest argument for accusing Rudy of the crimes of grooming are just a few things he said in the story, then your argument doesn't really hold up, because ultimately his actions don't really reflect the allegations. The actual act of grooming involves an adult exploiting a minor, whether through coercion or manipulation, for sexual favors. Roxy being an adult and Rudy himself a child, as talked about earlier in this video, makes this impossible. But more than that, you have no actual proof that it was ever really a thing, other than him using otome game strategies to get close to her. And even if you want to say that Roxy telling Rudy to ask her again when he's an adult as a result of his attempts, I've got news for you. That's really just her deflecting so she doesn't have to hurt his feelings. This is a child asking her. She doesn't want to say no directly, so she's basically giving an impossible condition. Effectively, it comes down to he made comments about his preferred women, and people took that and ran with it. Rather than some malevolent manipulator seeking sexual pleasure, he comes off more as a bumbling idiot of a pervert chasing the thrills of something he's never experienced. I mean, some of his moves are just absolutely blatant in front of her, and she doesn't even bat an eye. Now, there is an actual, extra incident to be discussed here that isn't really a crime, since both parties involved consented to what happened, and both are actually adults when this happens. And this is the cheating allegations that we see at the end of Season 2, and what has ultimately fueled the grooming Roxy part of it. To quickly resolve some points, Sylphie gave her okay for this out of unconditional love for Rudy. She's not a victim in this. In spite of it being cheating, and even Rudy is viewing it as such, there's no victim as Sylphie accepts the situation almost as if it doesn't matter much, and Rudy ends up with 2 wives. Unrealistic as it is, that's how the story played out. The real issue is that Rudy slept with her after already being married, and his behavior in that incident. There's no real good way to put it. He admits that he was terribly rough with her, and it was her first time, so it wasn't exactly a pleasant experience. Just a casual note that Elaine at least warned her and kind of predicted that this would happen. So not exactly the sweet, tender moment Roxy had hoped for, but nonetheless a consensual one. Plus, we can also extract from this Roxy taking advantage of Rudeus during this broken state after everything that happened at the end of Season 2. In any case, we can pretty much dismiss the idea of her being groomed and talk about how he did some pervy things and had some nasty comments. In the case of Roxy Migurdia, 1 count of grooming, Rudeus is innocent, multiple counts of sexual harassment, definitely guilty, and 1 count of cheating on his wife, guilty. So that brings us to plaintiff number 2, the one that kinda gets him into the most trouble, Sylphiette. And what do we have to unpack here? 1 allegation of grooming and a lot of storytelling. Now, we'll just start with the damning part of this whole thing right out the bat, and that really puts Rudy on thin ice. He straight up has a debate with himself about turning Sylphie into his ideal woman while growing up together. I guess there's an argument where this could have been intended to mean something other than emotional manipulation or brainwashing, but it's pretty hard to see that without knowing what went on in the author's head when writing it. On surface level, this is a pretty bad look, at least without any additional context from the story. What I can say is some specific facts on this situation. Rudy does argue against himself, against the thought of making Sylphie his ideal bride. That is the exact quote. Ultimately, he does kind of lean towards doing it, but the conclusion that he executed on this plan remains unsupported. And that lends this whole situation to the interpretation of entertaining your darkest thoughts, but not actually ending up acting on them. In fact, this is the only time where Rudy shows any kind of manipulative inclination, and all their future interactions are framed as entirely wholesome and pure. It's also the only time he quote-unquote shows interest in Sylphie as a romantic or sexual partner. Other than that, it's nothing. Rudy sees her as a friend, someone he trusts and cares deeply for, as evidenced by his consideration of her in these things. You can actually find evidence of this in the story. Case in point, there's the issue of Rudy specifically not wanting any sort of physical relationship with Sylphie, nor even a romantic one, until they were of appropriate age. He openly acknowledges she's far too young to even understand the concept of that, and is content to simply have her as his friend for the time being. Effectively, it would be like taking an offhand comment from a character remarking that they wanted to kill someone and making an entire stance on that when it was really just an expression of their displeasure in the moment. There was a statement made, yes, but you have no follow-up action to prove he ultimately decided upon taking that course of action. Hell, just as much as you can headcanon in the fact that he actually did it, you could also headcanon in the fact that he ultimately decided not to. And well, we actually have more proof of the fact that he didn't than he did. Because if that were the case, the author would have given us some updates on how this was going. We would have seen some follow-up actions to support that conclusion, but we don't. There is another argument that people will make about Paul separating the two forcibly to stop Rudy from grooming her, but I think this is an entire misinterpretation of the situation yet again. From Paul's perspective, the 2 children were practically insular. They weren't the only children in the village by a long shot, and yet they were never seen with the others. Stack that on top of his existing worries due to Rudy never wanting to leave the house before meeting Roxy, and you can start to see the reason Paul wanted to separate them. His interpretation was that there was an unhealthy amount of codependence and that they'd become incapable of handling change in their lives in favor of each other and this insular little life they were building. His big fear was that they'd become emotionally dependent on each other and not be capable of relationships with other people. In addition, there was also the fear he had that Rudy would eventually grow bored of Sylphie and abandon her for another girl, specifically stemming from Paul's own nature, which would shatter the girl's entire life to pieces, as all she really had was her parents and her only friend, Rudeus. So really it had nothing to do with any suspicion of grooming. It was about the dependence they had on each other. Paul wanted both of them to grow up emotionally healthy and capable of being independent in the case they ultimately walked separate paths in life. He was worried for Sylphie's state of mind, and he was worried that Rudy would go back to his more shut-in tendencies. If Rudy continued to do everything for Sylphie, she'd never be able to stand on her own, so it wasn't so much to protect her from Rudy that he separated them, but rather so that she could grow up to be a regular adult that wouldn't need to fear separation from her friend. And given the events of the story, that's some pretty good foresight. This still doesn't change that very dodgy conversation he had with himself, but the results are bunk if you want to talk about the supporting evidence for the grooming case, unless I can get direct confirmation from Ryufujin himself about what all that was supposed to mean. It would be like talking about robbing a bank, but never actually doing it, or better yet, contemplating a robbery and considering how it would be done, but then shelving the idea altogether and never acting on it. Ladies and gentlemen, is it a crime to think? But that being said, Rudy never really does much towards Sylphie until much later when they're reunited. And they're both adults by this world's standards when they meet again and eventually bang before settling down and getting married. And it's mostly her prompting for him to do so when it comes to the sex. Light novel and anime Rudy specifically expresses interest in developed women. He has some sleazy remarks about how he values youth and purity, the Roxy stuff, and later on when he says that being a virgin is out of attractiveness to his wife Sylphie. But he has his own line that he delineates by with the statement that he has no interest in prepubescent girls early in the story, when he states that he isn't interested in Sylphie like that at 6 years old, and even expresses concern for her well-being by responding that she isn't even ready for such a thing at that age. Yeah, Rudy specifically avoids that sort of relationship with Sylphie because he understands she's not ready for it. I feel like this kind of thing gets overlooked. Rudy was actually concerned about Sylphie's well-being and fitness for a relationship and drew a hard line at engaging in that kind of activity with her. Even in the bath scene, when he discovers that she's a girl and not a boy, there's nothing sexual going on there at all. It's all just shock that she isn't a boy. Even more proof that Rudy doesn't really have any interest in her sexually at that time. So whatever attraction he had was purely out of actual friendship and a desire for companionship for once in his life. All things in perspective, let's talk about the verdict. In the case of Sylphie, we can conclude that Rudy definitively did contemplate the path of turning Sylphie into his ideal bride, but ultimately never acts on it. We don't get any comments from Rudy about how it's going along, like, I've been making strides in brainwashing Sylphie, or she's gotten used to doing this or that, or I've shown her this sort of sexual act. The typical stuff you would expect to actually prove he did a thing. The story does not give you proof that he actually did it. In fact, it's almost treated as if it never happened. So you have to infer that he did based on a malevolent interpretation of the series of events surrounding that conversation with himself. So while it's not something you should have a conversation with yourself about, it's hardly equal to committing actual acts. So on this account of grooming Sylphie, Rudy is innocent. Not to mention the fact that the decade they spent apart from each other after Rudy is sent off to tutor Eris Greyrat. Speaking of whom, that brings us to our final plaintiff, Eris Greyrat. And this one is by far the worst example of Rudy's behavior because it's the clearest example of him being a sex pest. The charges are many accounts of sexual harassment and maybe a little sexual assault. From groping to making passes at the girl to outright trying to nab her panties while she's asleep in a barn. Yeah, there's no misunderstanding here. Like I said earlier in the video, Rudy is very clearly in a position where, regardless of whether we consider him a child or an adult, he should clearly know better than to do these things. His treatment of Eris is by far his most blatantly repulsive behavior in my mind, but even then, there are some hard lines he never actually really crosses. So yeah, he's definitively guilty of groping Eris and trying to steal her panties. Unlike other allegations, we actually have recorded proof of these events. And retaliation for those events, where he gets the shit beaten out of him for them. So yeah, he deserves and gets punishment for that. In fact, I think there's hardly a Mushoku Tensei fan out there who thinks his behavior in these instances is justifiable or an acceptable way to behave. I've seen a few points made about these events. Like, Rudy's primary motivation in some of these cases was revenge for the beatings he would take from Eris, but that hardly makes it acceptable to grope a sleeping girl and try to steal her underwear off her. That's still sick and disgusting in its own right, but he wasn't trying to rape her, groom her, or anything else of that matter. In fact, the only time it came close to any intercourse before turning point 2 was when Eris's father tried to coerce her into making the first move. And Rudy accepted it, being the opportunist he is, but that never actually went through. Hell, he even immediately realizes that some of his actions in that situation were entirely wrong, that he shouldn't have acted on it, and felt immediate remorse for what he had done.
Everything Eris did today was for me. She worked so hard because she cares about my feelings, and I just ignored hers.
I'm the worst.
Rudy's actions can pretty much be classified more so as perverted than terribly evil. That doesn't make them good things or admirable traits, but it does show that he has certain lines he won't cross and certain things he absolutely is willing to do just because. By the time we get around to any sort of actual sexual intercourse between Rudy and Eris, she's an adult by her world standards, and even the one to initiate it all because she feels desperate and lonely, and she's afraid that if she doesn't make Rudy a part of her family, he'll leave her. And that ultimately makes her the one doing anything criminal, because Rudy's actually still a minor at that point. So yeah, that's where the scum part comes from. I've never considered that fact to be in question. But again, the concept of Rudy being a controversial character and rather scummy figure has never once been in question. This pretty much strikes down the huge allegations that people like to lob against Rudy, that he's somehow a PDF file groomer. Now there's one more part to that allegation, namely a decanonized event from a deleted web novel chapter that details how he was spying on his niece in the bathroom in the first life. An objectively shitty thing to do in any case that I will not defend. If that had actually been a part of the mainline story, I wouldn't be making all these arguments, but it's decanonized. In fact, according to some people I've seen talk about it, it was never even a part of the original web novel and had nothing to do with Mushoku Tensei. People often act as though this were some damning piece of evidence, when in reality, it's been completely removed from the continuity altogether by the author. So again, it's not an actual event that happens in this story, yet it's something people will cling to as if it speaks volumes to this rendition of Rudy's character. And in one final note, while we have largely established that Rudy is technically a child, there's still the issue of treating his behavior in regards to his mental ability, and thus the need to go through and actually look at his crimes. Sure, he may be a child, but his behavior is not justifiable because he should know better. The issue becomes, how far do we take this line of thinking, because even in spite of legally being an adult in his past life, it's hard to qualify him as mature considering he's a very stunted and underdeveloped individual mentally due to his experience in high school. The old Rudy became a person frozen in adolescence somewhere in the middle of his teen years because he couldn't move on from the hurt caused by his bullying. He's clearly a maladjusted individual. He was clearly socially deprived by his own volition. There's no doubt about the fact that the person Rudy used to be was a stunted, poorly socially adapted person whose behavior needed a lot of adjustment in order for him to fit into society. So him behaving this way was almost expected, considering in his last life this is how he thought life was, since his only view of it was through fiction. But that still doesn't really justify anything that he's done. And that is why I ultimately think the connection between his two lives is an important element, because if it really only exists in his memories, and his whole life and outlook is shaped by those memories, he ultimately isn't really considered an adult either way. I personally would judge Rudy as a young boy who should very well know better and could reasonably be expected to behave more maturely than he did throughout this story up until his academy arc. But trying to make him out as an adult feels wrong for many of the reasons that I've mentioned in part 1. I would actually put him mentally more in the category of a teenager, given how he was behaving in any given point up until the academy. He has his fair share of misdeeds and shortcomings in this life, particularly with Eris, but he's hardly the villain many want to make him out to be. So that brings us to the final part of this video. One of the most crucial parts that we need to address. The interpretation of all these events within the realm of fiction. And now there are two general issues with Mushoku Tensei when it comes to interpretation. And let's start with the first, and that is, what is the intention behind the creation of Rudy? Rudy was meant to be someone with a miraculous second chance at life, and someone wholly undeserving of it at that. He's immature, a failure of a human being, and all around repulsive to the point of his family kicking him out of his home. But the point behind his character is a simple message. People can change. And that's what makes his character compelling. He's able to recognize this and take advantage of this undeserved second chance. The fact is that most of what Rudy does is used to frame the character as a flawed individual. What many people don't seem to realize is that the story is not promoting this kind of behavior or telling the audience to mimic it. It is there simply to demonstrate that Rudy has flaws and things that he actually does need to fix about himself, and that there are areas where he can grow. It shows that when you refuse to take life seriously, when you refuse to try, and when you refuse to actively grow up and choose to actively wallow in your own self-pity, your life will inevitably deteriorate because life requires an active effort to maintain. But more than anything else, it really does show his immaturity. He's a child who thinks himself far more grown up than he is, yet he's prone to chasing his desires, retaliating against people in unfit ways because he fails to understand others, and overestimates himself because he's gotten on in life so well up to this point without really trying much. But that's ultimately the point of his story. Rudy is meant to make mistakes along the way because he is a terribly flawed person with a mountain of issues to overcome. As time goes on, he matures and becomes a much more grown-up and well-adjusted person. But he can't ever get there without stumbling over his own troubles and realizing where he falls short. He moves out of that phase of his life as he finally begins to understand just how much of a child he really is, in spite of the years of memories he has stored up in his head after losing his parents a second time. In this life, Rudy got a semi-normal life because he actually tried. It's not a story about redemption nor great heroics. It's a story about how someone can change. How even a person as broken as our nameless shut-in could ultimately be rehabilitated if given the chance. Rudy in his previous life was a man who never actually grew up. His whole tragic tale starts because he becomes complacent and doesn't make an effort. That lands him in a bad school, where he gets bullied and eventually faces humiliation that cripples him. And as a result of all of that, he gave up on ever trying to put in the effort to overcome it. Like I said, the whole point is that Rudy is someone who thinks he's an adult because he has a bunch of adult memories, but never actually acts like a full adult. He's standing on top all the memories of his past life, but even then the nameless shut-in was nothing more than a man-child who decided he was too afraid of everything to do anything with his life. He gave up, and as a result, his life stagnated. He ended up trapped in that juvenile state of mind. But that concept seems to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Thus, They struggle to really comprehend what the story is putting forward. It's been interpreted as enabling the worst parts of his personality, but if that were the case, why would he then change into something respectable, caring, and family-oriented? The exact opposite of all his worst qualities at the start of the story. The truth is that the story allows Rudy to fail without beating him over the head too harshly for doing so. I think there's a very good example of this with the two girls I've mentioned, one with Sylphiette when he ripped her underwear off not knowing she was a girl, and one with Eris when he crossed the line she wasn't comfortable with. In both cases, he quickly realized he was wrong to do these things, and that he had hurt someone. He demonstrates remorse and a desire to try and make amends in both those cases as well. If the world were set up to enable his worst qualities, he'd never actually be in a position where he'd feel like that. He's not ignoring the lines altogether. He's simply got a skewed idea of where they are. And that presents a larger issue at play that has somewhat infected the anime community. An allergic reaction to anything that makes them uncomfortable. There are some people who seem to have it in their head that simply covering these concepts, that by having a character who wrestles with the idea of evil or does something that is morally wrong, that you inherently support such things as a fan or a creator. We've seen this happen to many series. Berserk being notable because it's gotten this treatment many times due to the fact that the Eclipse is a grotesque display of evil meant to mark Griffith as someone utterly unforgivable. Yet people continue to say that it somehow supports the actions that the literal villain of the story is depicted doing. Berserk doesn't show support for Griffith's actions. They're portrayed as evil. Yet, emotionally unstable people came across it and, rather than just not watching the show or reading the manga, decided to broadcast how evil it is to the internet for simply covering the idea of a villain doing something heinous and villainous. And here again we see it with jobless reincarnation. People have such an emotional reaction to things that they don't like to hear about that they automatically assume you support said thing if you decide to include it in the story. They fail to evaluate how the story treats those things and seem to think that it's unilaterally supporting those things just because it decides to talk about them. When it comes to jobless reincarnation, whether it be the sex stuff or the lack of action Rudy seems to take against the slave trade in his world, people seem to love misinterpreting this series as something that it isn't because it talks about something they end up having an emotional allergic reaction to. So, because jobless reincarnation shows that a pervert shut-in can become a well-adjusted family man who loves his wives and children, it must automatically condone all the negative behavior of its main character. We'll just casually have to forget the overarching trend of the story, the way in which it's all portrayed, and any other context surrounding it. Do you know what we call that? Cherry picking. What you are doing is taking one section of the story and manufacturing headcanon around it to support your conclusion, which is utterly insane, especially when it conflicts with what the story actually says and shows. You need proof of the action. You need to show something was actually done, not just words said. It is a fundamental failure to understand what a series of events means in a story in favor of an emotional reaction to a certain section of said story that appeals to your emotions strongly. Being too emotionally caught up in your own reaction to an event to fully analyze the situation and make a judgment on something based on actual facts makes you the problem, not the person or thing you're complaining about. And ultimately, authors are allowed to depict these things. Acts of evil are an important part of demonstrating how unredeemable a character is, or how villainous they really are, or how they struggle with certain issues, or how they try to overcome the sins of their past. When it comes to this conversation, a friend of the channel that I've had on, The Questioners, likes to mention Padan Thane from The Wheel of Time, an utterly reprehensible evil character who seems to relish in his vile actions. But to see that and say that The Wheel of Time implicitly condones everything he did would be insane! Starting down the road of trying to bar people from even discussing the issue of evil, or of having a protagonist who struggles with something robs a story of any real meaningful moments. You stifle creativity and seek to destroy human expression when you clutch your pearls over something like this. Ultimately, it comes down to just how something is portrayed in a story that determines whether that portrayal is healthy or not. Jabba's reincarnation is framed as some terrible, awful story that enables all of Rudy's most terrible qualities, yet his change in the story doesn't go from pervert to more of a pervert. It goes from pervert to a normal man with a family. If being a supportive family man is one of the worst qualities he has, then damn, I think your morals are fucking backwards. If fighting a god who nearly killed him in his first encounter just to save his family is a negative, bad value, then I think you're fucked in the head. This point of view that Rudy is evil because his past is spotted with mistakes and moral failings never takes into account the many more good things Rudy does with his life. The good things that ultimately pay off much more than any of the things derived from the worst parts of his personality. I can name a dozen things that Rudy does that stem from the best parts of him, that pay off far more than anything that seems to come from his more broken parts. In fact, it's the broken parts that hold him back the most, the worst parts of him that he ultimately abandons as he gets older. To then say that someone cannot possibly struggle with wrong and then correct themselves and live a redeemed life is, well, it's vindictive. And that reminds me of a comment made on my last Mushoku Tensei video. Quote, "Problem is, we live in an era of hyper-moralizing vindictiveness, drilled into people through the constant talk about victims and their plights. These people have no desire, nor ability to follow narratives about people who have committed certain wrongs in their eyes because they view those wrongs as unforgivable, and view narratives that explore improvement and redemption for such wrongdoings as either moral endorsements of those behaviors, or as having such a high standard for how to do that right in fiction that hardly any story that doesn't doom the wrongdoer to abject misery cannot reach their bar, usually because they're projecting their own past or prospective victimization onto the victims, real or imagined, of characters like Eris Greyrat. Plainly put, a generation of emotionally frail and terminally online people immediately draw a parallel between their own issue with sensitive topics and immediately extrapolate from shows like Mushoku Tensei that they're shows which trivialize their trauma, or that of a group they imagine has suffered relevant trauma, and take the side of those who inflict it rather than those who suffer from it. It's a very simple and black and white mindset in which the issues of the supposed victimizer is never considered nor deserving of empathy unless sufficient and serious punishment is doled out first. Of course, considering all the misery that Rudeus goes through, it should be apparent that to some, no amount of punishment will ever suffice. In all of this, Rudy is far from perfect, and far from a beacon of righteousness. Nobody is trying to argue he is, but he is an example of how someone with their own problems can ultimately turn their life around for the better. Reducing him to one of the worst kinds of sexual predators is a distortion of that fact. But if your aversion to the uncomfortable areas covered in this story pushes you to condemn him, then you haven't actually watched or read the story, because the actions you're condemning him of, his own story condemns.